Chapter 146 Dance. Neil noticed Mia's shoulders stiffen the moment he walked up behind her at the glass wall, and her reactions to him began to genuinely confuse him. Rather than turning her into his arms and kissing her, which was what he would have done if she were any other woman he had paid to pleasure him, he decided on a more subtle method of getting her where he wanted her to be without making her uneasy. Shoving his hands into his pockets, he met her gaze in the glass wall, tipped his head toward the house speaker where the song was still playing in the background, and said with a teasing formality, "May I have the next dance, Miss Harrison?" She turned around, her enchanting smile aglow with surprise, and Neil's spirits soared crazily simply because she was pleased. He shoved his hands deeper into his pockets to keep himself from touching her and said with a wry, small grin, "The last time I asked a woman to dance with me, I was more properly dressed for the occasion in a white shirt, black tie, and my favorite black suit. But too bad. She turned me down and embarrassed me in front of my peers." "Really? Why did she do that?" she asked, curious to know what sort of a woman would turn down such a man. Neil smiled. "She turned me down because she probably thought I was too short for her liking." Mia raised a confused eyebrow because Neil Wayner was 6 feet 3 inches tall, and she couldn't help but think he was either joking or else the woman had been a giant. "Were you really shorter than she was?" she asked to confirm her thoughts. He nodded. "I was barely above her stomach. But I didn't regard that as a serious obstacle at the time because I had a wild crush on her." He laughed. Realization dawned on her then, and her small smile faded completely. "How old were you?" "5, he answered. She looked at him as if she thought the rejection had hurt him, which, now that he thought about it, it didn't, because it was just his childhood nonsense of having a crush on a woman older than he was at his late father's birthday party. And that had happened before he'd met the little girl who'd become his little Mimi then. "If I were there, I would never have turned you down, Neil," she whispered softly. The little catch in her voice and the soft look in her eyes were almost Neil's undoing. Mesmerized by the foreign feelings unfolding inside him, he pulled his hands out of his pockets and silently held his left palm out to her, his gaze locked to hers. She laid her smaller hand in his, and he slid his arm around her narrow waist, drawing her close against him, while Louis Capaldi's song, "Burning," filled the room with his incredible voice stirring unknown emotions into Neil. "Well, maybe I'm a fool for falling in love with you when I had nothing left to lose. And nothing more I could give, went down with your sinking ship. Now I don't think I'll make it through. Now it's only the beat of my heart. That reminds me not to stare at the sparks. Can't set fire to my soul just to keep you." The song's lyrics swirled around in the background. A jolt suddenly shook Neil when he felt her legs and thighs coming into intimate contact with his own as she matched his steps with effortless grace, and when she laid her cheek lightly against his chest, his heart began to beat much too fast than it had ever before. He hadn't even kissed her yet, and desire was already pounding through every nerve ending in his body. To distract himself from his feelings, he tried to think of an appropriate topic of conversation that would further his ultimate goal without immediately arousing him more than he already was. Recalling that it had felt good to joke about the tire he'd spoiled, he decided that it would benefit both of them if they could laugh about other events that hadn't been one bit funny at the time. Furthermore, he liked the feeling of laughing with her. He wanted to laugh more and forget about his problems for as long as they were here, for now. Linking his fingers through hers, he brought her hand against his chest and said lightly against her hair, "By the way, Miss Harrison, about your unscheduled flights over the mountains on that snowbike today." Mia caught his wry tone immediately. She tilted her head back, and showed her expression of wide-eyed innocence that Neil had to fight back the urge not to kiss that innocence off her face. "Yes, what about it?" she said. "Where the hell did you go when you shot over the edge of the mountain like a rocket and vanished?" He frowned down at her. Mia's shoulders shook with laughter as she noticed his frown. "I landed in the embrace of a large pine tree." "That was very clever of you," he teased. "You stayed nice and dry and tricked me into acting like an insane person in that freezing river." Instead of taking his words as the joke he'd intended it to be, Mia's expression turned serious. "That part wasn't funny. What you did was the bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do." Neil felt the hardness in his heart melt away. It wasn't the words she said that melted him, it was the way she was looking at him, the admiration in her eyes, the awed wonder in her voice. After the humiliation of his trial and the dehumanizing effects of his time in prison, it was heartwarming to be looked at like a man, not an animal. Moreover, To have her look at him as if he were brave and normal and decent was a gift more precious to him than anything he had ever been given. She didn't look at him like his uncle did. He wanted to crush her in his arms, to lose himself in her sweetness, to wrap her around him like a blanket and bury himself in her. He wanted to be the best lover she'd ever had and to make this night as memorable for her as it was going to be for him. Mia watched his gaze drop to her lips, and in a state of anticipation that had mounted to dizzying excitement in the last hour, she waited for him to kiss her. When it became obvious he wasn't going to do it, she covered her disappointment with her best, brightest smile and tried to be amusing. "If you ever meet Owen again, please don't tell him I danced with you tonight." "Why not?" he asked calmly, but deep down, there was nothing calm about his feelings. "Because he picked a fight with the last person I danced with at an event." Despite the absurdity of it, Neil felt a sharp twinge of jealousy in his heart, and before he could control himself, he remarked, "You seem to love Owen more than I thought you do then. No doubt you wish you were with him rather than I." He began to release her waist with a dark scowl on his face. But Mia chuckled at his dark scowl and hastily spoke before he'd release her. "No, I'd rather be with you than with him, you." "Damn you," he chided her, then catching her by surprise, he pulled her tightly against his length while "All of Me" by John Legend began to play on the house device in the background. No matter how hard Neil tried to think it through, he couldn't tell what was wrong with his emotions. "I know exactly how your poor fiancé must have felt when he saw you dancing with another man. If he were the one, he'd have beaten the man to near death." Mia rolled her eyes. "You don't really expect me to believe that you were jealous just now, do you?" Neil's eyes fixed greedily on her full lips. "4 minutes ago," he murmured, "I would have said I was incapable of feeling such a lowering emotion." "Yeah, right," she said with amusement in her voice, not taking his words of feeling jealous seriously. If there was something she was 100% certain of, it was that Neil Wayner didn't love her. She then added, "You are overacting, General Wayner." Neil went still at that. If he had to make a choice between having Mia imagine him as an escaped convict when he took her to bed tonight or as the general he once was, he'd have chosen the former without hesitation. At least the former was better at this moment. As a general, he'd spent more than a decade of his life living with an image of the world's hero. He'd had his privacy and his life invaded by unknown heiresses who wanted to sleep with the infamous General Wayner. Not the man, the image. In fact, this evening had been the first time he had ever been absolutely certain a woman wanted him simply for himself and not because he was the infamous General Wayner, and it made him angry to think that he had been wrong. "Why," Mia said cautiously, "are you looking at me like that? Why did you have to bring up General Wayner at this particular moment, and why would you think I'm overreacting?" He raised a demanding brow. "I don't think you'll like the answer," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Try me, señorita," he clipped. Her eyes narrowed at his tone but she said, "All right, I said it because I hate insincerity." Neil's brows snapped together. "Do you think you could possibly be a little more specific here?" "Definitely," Mia replied, then continued to explain with an uncharacteristic bluntness. "I said it because you pretended that you were jealous. And I thought it was not only unlike you but insincere, particularly because I know, and you know, that I have to be the least attractive woman you would bother to have feelings for in your entire arrogant life. Furthermore, after you were sent to prison, I learned from your so-called, soon-to-be wife, Davina, that you only got yourself into my life because you wanted to get some information from me. She told me everything I didn't know about your mission. So, since I'm not treating you like a murderer anymore, I'd also appreciate it if you'd at least be sincere with me and not act like I meant something more than the desire we both have for each other." So that she wouldn't give her heart the hope that there was a chance of being loved by him, she'd rather prefer he be sincere with his feelings rather than pretend. Mia thought, finally registering the thunderous expression on his face, she jerked her gaze from his and stared at his shoulder, embarrassed and ashamed for letting her hurt feelings drive her to such an outburst. She braced herself for his explosion, but after a moment of ominous silence she said in a small voice, "I suppose I probably didn't need to be that specific. I'm sorry. Now it's your turn." "My turn to do what?" he retorted calmly. "I imagine you'd tell me that I was rude and obnoxious just now." She muttered softly while avoiding his gaze. "If that's what you want to hear, then fine. You were." He had stopped dancing a moment ago, and Mia drew a long breath before she raised her gaze to his impassive face. "You're angry, aren't you?" she asked in a small voice. I'm not certain. What do you mean, you aren't certain? I mean that, where you're concerned, I haven't been certain of anything since the day I met you, and the uncertainty is getting worse by the moment we are staying together. He sounded so strange, so off balance, that Mia felt a gentle smile touch her lips. She doubted very much if any other woman, no matter how beautiful, could have put him in exactly this state she'd put him in now. She didn't know how it had happened, but she felt rather proud of it. I think, she said happily, I like that. He wasn't amused. Unfortunately, I don't. He didn't like the feeling he was having, nor did he like the wild beating of his heart whenever he looked into her eyes. Chapter 147 Don't. He wasn't amused. Unfortunately, I don't. He didn't like the feeling he was having, nor did he like the wild beating of his heart whenever he looked into her eyes. Oh, Mia drawled, disappointed at the realization that what she'd read into his expression wasn't really what she'd thought it to be. Neil continued to speak. In fact, I think we'd better reach some sort of clear understanding about what is going on between us and what we want to go on between us. In the back of his mind, Neil knew he was being completely irrational, but 5 years of imprisonment along with the harrowing emotional and physical events of the days, and the roller coaster ride she'd had him on for the last 24 hours, were all combining to play havoc with his temper, his emotions, and his judgment. Well, do you agree? He asked impatiently. I guess so, she murmured softly. Fine. Do you want me to start talking right now, or would you like to sit down? She swallowed, torn between dread and amusement at the fact that he even cared to ask if she'd sit down when he'd already looked so impatient to set the thing going on between them. I don't have to sit down. He nodded and started to speak. Half the time we've been together, I have the craziest feeling that you're not real, that you're too naive to be 26 years old, that you're still a little girl pretending to be a woman. His little girl from the past, who he'd decided to bury away 5 years ago when he'd been sent to prison. Mia smiled with relief that he hadn't said anything worse. And the other half of the time? She urged him to continue speaking when he fell silent for a moment. You make me feel like I'm 12 again, he said, and he could tell she liked that from the quick, amused sparkle in her large brown eyes. Suddenly, Neil felt twistedly compelled to shatter whatever remaining illusions she might possibly have about him personally, as well as his intentions for the evening. He wasn't a Prince Charming gentleman from whatever fantasy world she must have thought he was. He was, in fact, the opposite of whatever she thought of him. Thus, he was set on making her understand that before anything would happen between them and then she'd get ahead of herself. He continued, no matter how you interpret what occurred at the river, I am not a knight in shining armor, Carida. I am not a hopeless romantic, and I am far from being a naive, idealistic teenager. Whatever innocence and idealism I was born with, I lost them a long time ago. I am not a child, and neither are you. We are adults. Both of us understand what is happening between us right now, and we are fully aware of where all of this is leading. The amusement faded from her eyes, replaced by a mix of emotions that were not quite fear and not quite anger. Do you want me to continue, so there is no misunderstanding my intentions? He pressed on, observing a blush spreading across her smooth cheeks as her smile vanished. Disheartened by the realization that his desire to take her to bed had erased her smile, he purposefully expressed his point without sugar-coating his directness. My intentions are not noble, they are mature and natural. We are not teenagers, and this is not a school dance, with my mind not set with whether I will be able to kiss you goodnight. It is already certain that I will kiss you goodnight. The truth is, I want you, and I believe you want me nearly as much. Before this night ends, I plan to ensure that you do, and once that is achieved, I plan to lead you to my bed, undress you, and make love to you thoroughly and unhurriedly. For now, I wish to dance with you, to feel your body against mine. As we dance, my thoughts will wander to all the things I intend to do to you, and with you, once we are in my bed together. Have I made everything clear? If none of this aligns with your wishes, then tell me what you desire, and we will act accordingly. Well, he asked impatiently as she remained silent, her head bowed. What do you want to do before we go to bed? Mia bit her trembling lip and raised her eyes glowing with a surprising amusement and said, How would you like to help me rearrange the entire house? She said, That's what I want to do. Do you have a second choice? He demanded, so irritated that he didn't realize she was joking. Actually, she said, furrowing her brows and lowering her gaze to the V at the throat of his open shirt collar. That was my second choice. Well then, what is your first choice? And don't pretend I'm making you so nervous you want to rearrange the entire house, because I couldn't make you nervous at gunpoint. Mia sighed and internally added annoyance and stubbornness to the qualities she admired in him. He was too short-tempered to take a joke for what it was. If she hadn't known about his temper, she'd have gotten offended by the look of annoyance in his eyes and voice. But she'd known him better to get offended. He was, after all, a temperamental Adonis. Mia took a shaky breath, ready to end the game, but she couldn't bring herself to look directly at him as she softly said, "You're correct. You couldn't possibly make me this nervous even under gunpoint, and after today, I could bet my life on it that you'd never hurt me for the world. The only thing that can make me nervous is your recent behavior." "What behavior?" he demanded. "I mean, your actions have me questioning if you'll ever kiss me the way you did last night. One moment you act like you really wanted to kiss me, and the next." Neil grasped her face, tilted it up, and passionately silenced her words with a deep kiss, running his fingers through her hair. As she responded by reciprocating his affection, sliding her hands up his chest and wrapping her arms around him and returning the kiss, he felt a growing sense of pleasure and overwhelming happiness that was almost unbearable. Trying to atone for his earlier roughness, he dragged his lips from hers and brushed a kiss along her jaw and cheek and temple. Then he sought her mouth again, rubbing his lips over their soft contours. He traced the trembling line between her lips with his tongue, urging them to part, and when they did, he dove fully into her mouth like a starving man helplessly trying to satisfy a hunger by teaching her to intensify it. And the woman in his arms was a willing and gifted student. She melted against him and crushed her mouth to his, welcoming his tongue and giving him hers with only the hint from him that he wanted it. Long minutes later, Neil finally forced himself to drag his mouth from hers and lift his head. He gazed down into her moistened brown eyes, unconsciously memorizing the way she looked, all flushed and fresh and alluring. Trying to smile, he slid his hand around her nape and slowly stroked his thumb over her soft bottom lip, but the deep brown of her large eyes were pulling him unstoppably into their depths again. His thumb stopped moving on her lips. He then pressed it down to force her lips apart and hungrily captured her mouth with his again. Trembling in his arms, she leaned up on her toes and the slight increase in pressure against his rigid erection made his heart thunder and his fingers clench convulsively against her back. He crushed her smaller body into his hands rushing over the sides of her breasts and back, then angling across her buttocks, holding her tightly against his straining body. He was losing control, and he knew it. Neil told himself to slow down, ordered himself to stop before he forced her to the floor and followed her down, before he behaved like the sex-starved monster he was instead of the leisurely lover he'd promised to be in his angry outburst. However, he couldn't stop. He wanted her so bad he couldn't command his body to obey him. It was the distant, nagging memory of his promise that finally made him try to slow down and prolong what was to come, and to heed the warning of his pounding arousal that the climax was going to happen much too quickly for her, once it began now. He slowly forced his hands away from her breasts and settled them on the curve of her waist instead, but it was harder by far to stop the driving movements of his tongue when she was clinging to him and answering and digging her nails into his back. When he finally pulled his mouth an inch from hers, Neil wasn't certain if it was she or he who moaned with the loss before she leaned her forehead weakly against his chest, breathing shakily. With his eyes closed and his heart pumping fast, he dragged air into his lungs and slid his arms around her back to steady her against him. But it was no use, he had to have her, all of her, now before he'd run mad from the desire flowing into his body. Drawing a ragged breath, he put his hand under her chin and tipped her face up. Her eyes were closed with the shadows of her long lashes lying on her creamy cheeks, and she instinctively lifted her lips to his. Neil's control snapped with her action. His mouth captured hers with fierce desperation, forcing her lips to part as his hands pulled the silk tie of the robe she wore over the red dress, then shoved it apart, pushing the sleeves of her dress down her arms and sending it to the floor in front of the fireplace so that he could feast on the sight and touch of her skin. Wrapped in his arms, naked, Mia felt him lowering her to the floor, but she didn't snap out from her state of mindless pleasure until he took his mouth and hands from her. She opened her eyes and saw him hurriedly unbutton his shirt and yank it off and tossed it aside, revealing the ominous-looking snake tattoos on his chest, but not until he looked up at her did she feel the first stirrings of panic of what was about to happen between them. In the firelight, his gray eyes had a fierce glitter as they moved restlessly over her naked body. Passion had turned his face hard and intense, making her suddenly feel shy, and when she lifted her arm self-consciously to cover her exposed breasts, his voice was harsh as he commanded, "Don't." Chapter 148, Making Love in the Fireplace, Part 1. In the firelight, his gray eyes had a fierce glitter as they moved restlessly over her naked body. Passion had turned his face hard and intense, making her suddenly feel shy, and when she lifted her arm self-consciously to cover her exposed breasts, his voice was harsh as he commanded, "Don't." Mia shivered involuntarily at his voice that sounded strange, and his face that had turned into that of a man who was on the verge of losing control of himself. And when he pulled her hands away from her breasts and covered her with his upper body, she realized instinctively that the preparation to get her ready was abruptly over, and he was going to be driving into her in a matter of moments unless she slowed him down by letting him know she'd never done this before. "Neil," she whispered softly, trying to make him listen without just blurting out that she was a virgin. "Wait." She pressed her hands panickingly against his chest to stop him when he began to settle himself between her legs, but the word didn't register with Neil. However, the panic in it struck a slight sense in him, and so did the fact that she was shoving on his shoulders and squirming against his thigh in a way that was wildly provocative and making it hard for him to stop. Neil knew he was going too fast, cheating on the foreplay he planned to have with her, and he thought she was objecting to that fact and wanted him to go slow. There's something I need to tell you before you." With an effort that nearly destroyed his strength, Neil finally made himself move onto his side, but when his eyes fell on her exposed breast, he lost it again. He bent his head to her breast to compel her, but she caught his face in her hands to stop him and forced it up. "Listen to me, please," Mia said, looking into his smoldering silver eyes. She spread her fingers over his rigid jaw, softening it, and when he turned his face into her palm and kissed it, her heart swelled with relief and tenderness towards him. "We have to talk first." "You can talk," he said huskily, pulling her tighter to him, kissing the side of her mouth and her neck, sliding his hand over her full breast, "and I'll listen," he whispered, his fingers already stroking down, past her flat belly and sliding into the wetness between her legs. But Mia jerked beneath him, grabbing his hand that had slid into her legs, and she fought back the moan of pleasure that rose to her throat, trying desperately to tell him that she hadn't done this before, but then not wanting to be blunt about the topic. In the back of her mind, she could still remember her discussion with Rain, who told her that men get turned off when they learned a woman was inexperienced in bed. Thus, even though she knew what she was about to say would sound and seem silly, she asked, "How old were you the first time you made love to a woman?" Neil closed his eyes and swallowed hard to control his impatience at the fact that she was stopping him at this moment to ask him such a question. But he answered it anyway. "I was 17. Don't you want to know how old I was then?" she asked, so nervous her voice was slightly trembling. "It doesn't matter to me," he said tightly. He didn't want to hear how Owen had touched and made love to her in bed, and to end the topic, he moved up to kiss her breast since for some reason, known only to her, she didn't want to be touched more intimately by him. His entire body was straining with need, and he was trying his hardest to touch her in the places that he'd learned very clearly in the past gave women the quickest and greatest pleasure. I was 26, she told him in a panicky voice when his mouth closed tightly on her nipple. Neil's blood was already roaring in his ears. He heard the words but not the meaning. All he could think about was how she tasted so good and felt even better than he'd remembered. Her breasts weren't large or heavy, but they were pretty and exquisitely feminine, just like she was, and if she would only be as receptive to him as she had been when they were standing and kissing, he would give her a climax now, before he came inside her, and then afterward he'd make love to her properly. He had 5 years of pent-up desire to expend. He would be able to make love to her all night without stopping if she would just let him do this and stop clamping her legs together, and stop talking about how old she was the first time she had sex. Mia knew the moment her words registered on him, because he lifted his mouth a fraction of an inch from her breast, and his body went so still she had the feeling he had stopped breathing. "This is the first time for me," she murmured shakily. He dropped his forehead on her breast and shut his eyes before cursing, "Fuck." The explosive whisper of his curse made it clear to Mia that he was not pleased by her revelation, and it even made it more clear when he finally raised his head and stared hard at her face, his eyes carefully inspecting each feature as if he were hoping to find some proof she was lying. He was either angry or disgusted, Mia concluded with a sinking heart. Rain had been right about men not wanting a virgin. And she hadn't wanted him to stop, but only to slow down and not handle her like a body that was used to being handled in bed. However, Neil was not disgusted. He was dumbstruck. He was confused. In this day and age, he would never imagine a 26-year-old woman could still be a virgin, let alone a woman who was beautiful, witty, intelligent, desirable, and engaged. Surely he'd once told her to remain a virgin, but he'd never meant those words, and he'd never thought she'd still remain untouched. But as he gazed at her lovely, anxious face, suddenly everything about her that had puzzled him last night and tonight began to make some sense. She had been acting shy because she'd never been to bed with any man. Evidently, she'd been engaged to Owen and no lovemaking in between. Now that he understood that, he was more confused than ever by the revelation. Apparently, she had withheld her virginity from her own fiancé, who obviously loved her and wanted to offer her respectability and a future filled with their children. Tonight, however, she was willing to surrender it to someone like him, who was incapable of loving anyone and who had nothing whatsoever to offer her in the future. Neil's conscience chose that moment to reassert itself for the first time in years by reminding him that Mia's fiancé hadn't coaxed her into surrendering her virginity to him. If Neil had any decency whatsoever, he'd keep his hands off of her at the realization that she was still a virgin, because she'd obviously reserved that to a man who deserves it. He'd already kidnapped her, verbally abused her, and subjected her to public embarrassment by keeping her with him. Adding all of that by robbing her of her virginity when he knew full well he had no intentions of loving, nor marrying her, was inexcusable and heartless. But the feeble protest of his conscience wasn't enough to stop him. He wanted her. He had to have her. He was going to have her. Fate had deprived him of his dignity, his freedom, and his future, but it had for some reason given her to him during these brief days of what was likely to be the end of his life. Neither his conscience nor anything else was going to deprive him of having her. Unaware of the time that had passed, Neil stared at her until her shaky voice snapped him from his thoughts, and her words were a clear evidence to her lack of experience with men. I didn't expect you to be angry about that," she said, completely misinterpreting the reason for his long silence. With a sigh, he said, "I'm angry with myself, not you." Mia searched his face. "Why?" she asked innocently. "Because," he whispered huskily, "it isn't going to stop me. Because it isn't going to matter to me one bit that you've never done this before, not even with someone who loved you or who could stay with you if he got you pregnant. Nothing matters to me right now," he whispered deeply, lowering his mouth to hers, "but this." But her inexperience did matter. It mattered enough to Neil to make him break off the kiss and try to get his lust under control, so that he could start over with her. "Come here," he whispered, gathering her into his arms and rolling onto his side so that she was facing him, her head pillowed against his shoulder. Breathing deeply, he waited for his pulse to return to normal, slowly running his hand down her back in a soothing caress, while he made the silent decision to make this good for her, even if he would die of lust in the process. Somehow, he was going to have to arouse her thoroughly without arousing himself more than he already was. Mia lay in his arms, bewildered by the sudden change in his mood and terrified that, despite his words, she'd apparently turned him off on the idea of making love altogether. Unable to stand it any longer, she kept her eyes on his throat and said shakily, "I didn't mean to make a big deal out of this being my first time. I just wanted to slow things down a bit, not stop you." Neil understood how difficult it must have been for her to express such feelings, and he felt another unfamiliar surge of tenderness toward her as he gently lifted her chin and solemnly stated, "Let's not diminish the significance of this moment for either of us. The truth is, I've never had the honor of being someone's first lover, so this is a first for me as well." Lifting his hand, he brushed her tousled hair off her cheek, slowly combing his fingers through it, watching it spill over her left breast as he mused aloud, "You must have been driving the men in Zen crazy all these years." Chapter 149, Making Love in the Fireplace, Part 2. Lifting his hand, he brushed her tousled hair off her cheek, slowly combing his fingers through it, watching it spill over her left breast as he mused aloud, "You must have been driving the men in Zen crazy all these years." "What do you mean?" Mia muttered softly, not sure what he meant by his remarks. Neil pulled his gaze from her breast and smiled wryly into her eyes. "I mean that I've been fantasizing about running my fingers over your gorgeous breasts since the day I once drove you to the local market in Zen, and I've only been able to imagine what it would look like with your hair down on it, until now." He whispered deeply, remembering the day she'd driven him crazy with lust after their grocery shopping in the local market, and how he'd only been able to imagine what she'd look like without her clothes on, wrapped naked in his arms. Mia felt a warmth begin to seep through her entire body at his stirring words, and Neil instantly sensed the change in her expression and the way her body relaxed against his. Finally, he remembered a time when Liam had once babbled to him that words could arouse a woman almost as well, and as quickly as the most skillful sexual stimulation, and he realized that at this moment, it was also the best way to accomplish his goal without driving himself to the dangerous extremes of lust that came with touching and kissing her. Softly and truthfully, he confessed, "Do you know what I was thinking last night during our dinner?" She shook her head so innocently he felt the urge to touch her all over and taint her innocence. "I was wondering how your mouth would taste on mine, and if your skin could possibly feel as soft as it looks," he breathed smoothly. Mia felt herself sinking into a deep, delicious sensual spell as he spread his fingers over her cheek and said, "Your skin is even softer than it looks." His thumb moved over her lips and his eyes watched the movement. "And your mouth. Damn, you taste like heaven." His hand slid skillfully down her throat, over her shoulder, then slowly covered her breast, and she shyly dropped her gaze to the ominous wide-mouthed snake tattoo that covered half of his chest. "Don't look away, Mia Moore," he whispered, and she forced her gaze back to his. "You have beautiful breasts." That, Mia felt, was so far from true that it made her doubt the other things he'd just said to her. She'd lived with the insecurities of her appearance for the past years in the university, and her breast was one of her biggest insecurities, to the extent she'd had to wear baggy shirts and sweaters then. Neil saw the skeptical look on her face, and his mouth quirked in a somber smile. "If you don't believe me," he whispered, his thumb moving back and forth over her nipple, "then you tell me why I'm dying to touch them and look at them and have my mouth on them right now." Her nipple tightened into a taut little bud against his thumb, and Neil felt lust begin to rage through him again. "You know it's true, Mia. You can see on my face how badly I want you," he breathed. She did see it because it was plain clear in his smoldering, heavy-lidded gaze how much he wanted her, and she wanted him as much as well. Dying to kiss her inviting lips, Neil drew a long, steadying breath and bent his head, fighting to hold himself in check as he touched his tongue to her lips. "You are so sweet, Mia Moore," he whispered huskily against her mouth. "You are so damned lovely." Mia's restraint broke before his did. And with a silent moan, she slid her hand around his neck and kissed him with all the passion building inside of her, pressing herself against his rigid length, melting in the shudder that racked his body as his mouth opened over hers in a rough, tender kiss. With an instinct she didn't know she possessed, she sensed his desperate struggle to prevent the kiss from becoming too erotic. He wanted to go slow on her, she realized. And with that realization, the tenderness she felt for him was almost past bearing. Brushing her parted lips over his, she coaxed him to deepen the kiss, and when that failed, she started kissing him the way he'd done to her earlier. She touched her tongue to his lips and felt the gasp of his indrawn breath. Encouraged by that, she let her tongue make a brief, sensuous movement in his mouth, probing lightly, and then sucking on his bottom lips. And with that action, she finally accomplished her goal. Neil's restraint broke with a low groan as he rolled her onto her back, kissing her with a raw, urgent hunger that made her feel at once powerful and helpless. His hands and mouth claimed her body, sliding over her breasts and waist and back, and when his mouth returned to hers again, he shoved his fingers into her hair, holding her a willing prisoner. When he finally lifted his mouth from hers, Mia's whole body was on fire with desire. "Open your eyes for me, little one," he whispered. Mia obeyed and found herself staring at a muscular male chest covered with tattoos. The mere sight of that chest made her pulse pound and made her feel the urge to run her fingers over the snake tattoo. Hesitantly, she raised her gaze from his chest and beheld the changes that passion had made in him. A muscle was moving convulsively in his throat, his face was hard and dark, and his eyes were burning. She watched his sensual lips form two words and heard the rasp in his voice as he pronounced them. "Touch me." It was an invitation, an order, and a plea. Mia responded to it. Raising her hand, she laid it on his cheek. Without taking his eyes from hers, he turned his face into her hand and slid his lips back and forth against her sensitive palm. "Touch me, Carita." Her heart began to pound furiously against her ribs as she trailed her fingertips down his hard cheek, over his neck, to his shoulder, then lower along the rigid planes of his chest. Slowly, she began to trace her fingers over his tattoo, His skin felt like satin, but when her fingers came into contact with the snake eyes, where it happened to be an injury covered with tattoo, she stopped her hand movement and lowered her gaze. Looking closely, Mia saw, for the second time, that his tattoos were made to cover some old injuries. She ran her hands over the hard lines, that looked to be carved against the side of his chest by some hard cord, or some iron, and felt a tightness in her throat. She wondered silently how he'd gotten such injuries, and when she leaned forward and pressed her lips against the tattoos, his muscles contracted reflexively. Intoxicated with her newfound power, she kissed his small nipples, then trailed a long kiss downward toward his waist. A half laugh, half groan escaped his mouth, and he abruptly rolled her onto her back, pinning her hands beside her head, his body half covering hers. His tongue plunged into her mouth, tangling with hers, plunging and retreating in clear imitation of what he wanted to do to her with his body, and the fire that had been building inside Mia exploded into flames. She managed to pull her wrists from his hands. Wrapping her arms around him, she turned into his arms and returned his drugging kisses, stroking his shoulders and back, moaning with joy as his mouth touched her breasts. So lost was she in the desire he was skillfully building in her that she barely noticed when his hand reached down between her thighs until his fingers began to explore her warm, wet entrance intimately. Clenching her eyes closed, she fought back waves of embarrassment and let herself yield to the exquisite pleasure his knowledgeable fingers were giving her. Fighting back his rampaging desire, Neil watched the reactions flicker across her lovely face as her body submitted to the unfamiliar, intimate stroking of his fingers. Each sound she made, each restless movement of her head, each time she quivered at his touch, filled him with an unnameable tenderness. Each second became a beautiful moment in his mind, as bright as a diamond. Beneath his fingers, she was opening for him, wet and warm, and he was desperate to bury himself in her. Instead, he held back, and bending his head, he kissed her long and thoroughly while he slid his finger deeply into her. She wrapped her arms around his shoulders and shivered, and the convulsive movement reminded him of her earlier words to him. "Shivering is a good sign," he whispered, increasing the depth of his exploration. "Shivering is very, very good." Around his fingers, she seemed unusually narrow and extremely tight, and he had an awful feeling that he was built too large for her, that she wouldn't be able to take his erection without being torn or hurt. But she surprised him when her hands began to move over him, gaining the courage to touch him freely. She then did something completely unexpected, and his breath caught short in his throat when she brushed her fingers over his rigid arousal and then took him in her hand. The moment her fingers wrapped around him, her eyes flew open in shock, moving on his face. If the situation weren't so dire and so urgent, Neil would have chuckled at the expression in her eyes. But he was in no mood to laugh or feel flattered that he'd obviously impressed her with his size. In the firelight, she looked at him as if she were waiting for something, a decision from him, a movement, and all the while her fingers were driving him crazy, until he was on the verge of exploding in her hand. Her other hand lifted to his jaw, soothing away the tension, and the words she whispered to him made him melt. "You were worth waiting 26 years for, Neil." Neil lost control of his breathing. With his palms on either side of her flushed face, he bent his head to kiss her, only this time the word he whispered was hoarse with awed respect. Heavens! With blood pounding in his ears and foreboding weighing him down, Neil positioned himself on top of her and between her legs, probing at the entrance of her body, easing his way slowly into her tight, wet passage, expelling his breath at the exquisite sensation as her body expanded to take him in, her wet warmth clasping him. When he encountered the fragile barrier, he lifted her slim hips with his hands, held his breath, and lunged forward. Mia's body stiffened with the brief pain that consumed her, but before he could react, her arms were around him and she was opening for him like a flower, welcoming him, sheathing him. Fighting to control the orgasm that was threatening to erupt, Neil moved slowly within her, but when she began moving with him, clutching him to her, his fragile restraint broke along with his desire to prolong the act. Seizing her mouth in a plundering kiss, he drove into her, forcing her faster and faster to the peak, driving her toward it, reveling in her muffled cry as she dug her nails into his back and began to shudder convulsively beneath him. Chapter 150 Making Love in the Fireplace, Part 3. Fighting to control the orgasm that was threatening to erupt, Neil moved slowly within her. But when she began moving with him, clutching him to her, his fragile restraint broke along with his desire to prolong the act. Seizing her mouth in a plundering kiss, he drove into her, forcing her faster and faster to the peak, driving her toward it, reveling in her muffled cry as she dug her nails into his back and began to shudder convulsively beneath him. Lifting her hips higher and tighter to him, he thrust harder, driven by some uncontrollable need to be as deep within her as possible when he came. And then he exploded inside her with a force that tore a low groan from his throat, but still he kept moving, as if she could somehow empty him of the bitterness of his past and the uncertainty of his future. The second climax erupted in a burst of sensation that screamed down his nerve endings, shook his entire body, and left him weak and exhausted. In a state of boneless exhaustion, Neil collapsed on top of her and shifted onto his side, still joined with her. Breathless from exertion, he held her in his arms, stroking her back soothingly, trying not to think of anything and clinging to his fading happiness as he fought to hold reality at bay. But after a few minutes, it was no use. Now that his passion was finally spent, there was no barrier between his brain and his conscience, and as he stared into the fireplace, he began to see all his actions and motives of the past few days in the light of glaring truth. The truth was that he had taken Mia as a hostage at gunpoint. He had blackmailed her into believing he would let her go if she took him to his destination. He had threatened her with physical violence if she tried to escape, and when she defied him anyway, he forced her to kiss him in front of a witness, the truck driver, and unknowingly made it appear as if she was an accomplice. He'd ruined her image in the country. All for what? His selfish ego of feeling betrayed about her engagement. Now he was starting to believe what his uncle had always thought of him. He was indeed a cold-hearted man with no sense of forgiveness, with a big ego that was as large as a mountain. Having sex with a woman he knew he'd never give his heart nor his life was a proof of that. The truth was that he had begun thinking about having sex with her the same day he'd taken her captive, and he had been campaigning for it using every means he had at hand, from intimidation to kindness to flirtation. The sickening truth was that he'd just managed to achieve his final, loathsome goal of getting back at her for making him feel betrayed. He'd seduced his childhood sweetheart, who had grown into a lovely, spirited, innocent young woman who had also repaid all his cruelties and injustices by saving his life today. Seduced was much too polite a word for what he'd just done, Neil decided with sick disgust as his gaze shifted to the carpet. He had taken her right here on the damned floor, not even in a bed. Neil's conscience clawed at him with a renewed anger for using her too roughly, for forcing her to take 2 climaxes from him, for burying himself all the way inside of her instead of using a little decent restraint. The fact that she hadn't even cried out or struggled or given any sign of being either hurt or humiliated did nothing to ease his guilt. However, she was so innocent she didn't know she was entitled to more than what she'd gotten today, but he did. He might not have lived his life around women, but he'd had more sexual flings than he could begin to count with nameless women he'd pay. The entire responsibility for the mess he'd made of Mia's entire life by making her appear as his accomplice, and now, her first encounter with sex, was solely and exclusively his. And that was looking at the matter in an optimistic way, without considering the possibility of her getting pregnant for having unprotected sex with him. He hadn't thought about that possibility a few minutes ago when he'd been too driven by his desires, but now that he did, he felt another rush of guilt consume him. He definitely wasn't going to marry her, nor anybody, and if she were to get pregnant. It wouldn't take a genius to figure out that a woman like Mia who'd obviously lighten up at the mere mention of children would never consider having an abortion, so she'd either have to bear the public shame of having the baby of a convicted murderer, or foisting his child off on her fiancé to father. Neil had fully prepared himself to be shot to death within days, or even hours after he left the safety of this house. Now, he wished to the heavens that he would have been caught before he ever got to meet Mia Harrison in Novaria again. Until he went to prison, he would never have considered involving Mia in his problems, let alone pointing a gun at her or getting her pregnant. In prison, he'd obviously become a sick sociopath without conscience nor morals. Shooting, he now realized, was too good of a punishment for the monster he had become. He had ruined her life. He deserved to be killed mercilessly. Neil was so involved with his own thoughts that it took all that time before it finally got to his brain that the woman he was holding in his arms was crying, and the dampness on his chest wasn't his sweat, but her tears. Speechless with remorse, he quickly loosened his hold on her and let her lie back on the carpet, but she kept her hand curved round his shoulder in a death grip and her wet face pressed against his chest. Leaning up on his elbow, he tried helplessly to comfort her by gently moving stray strands of gleaming hair from her damp cheek, while swallowing to ease the knot of regret in his throat. "Mia," he murmured softly, "if only I could undo all the wrongs I've inflicted upon you, I would. Until now, my actions were driven by dire circumstances. But this—" He paused, swallowing again, and awkwardly flicked a curl away from her temple. With her face buried against his chest, he couldn't judge her reaction, except for the fact that she had become completely motionless from the moment he began speaking. "But what I just did to you," he went on, "was utterly unforgivable. There may be reasons for it, but no justifications. Surely you're not so naive as to believe that 5 years is a short time for a man to endure without." Neil halted abruptly, realizing that he was compounding her hurt by implying that any woman would have sufficed to satisfy his prolonged sexual deprivation. "That was not my motive tonight. It played a part, yes. But the primary reason was my longing for you ever since." His words trailed off as self-revulsion surged up in his throat, rendering him unable to continue. After a prolonged moment of silence, the woman in his arms finally spoke. "Go on," she said softly. He tipped his chin down, trying to see her shadowy features, his brows drawing together in a puzzled frown. "Huh? Go on," he repeated. She nodded, her soft face brushing against his skin. "Yes, you were just getting to the good part." "The good part?" he repeated again blankly. She looked up at him and, although her eyes were still damp with tears, there was a winsome smile on her face that made Neil's heart slam against his ribs. "You got off to a very bad start," she whispered, "by saying you were sorry we did this. And you made it much worse by saying that I'm naive and then making it sound as if any woman would have suited you just fine after 5 years' abstinence." He gazed at her while relief began to pour through his entire body like a balm. He knew that he was getting off much too easily with his crime, but he seized his unexpected reprieve with the grateful desperation of a drowning man grabbing at a life preserver. "Did I say that?" "Yeah, you did." She smiled. He grinned helplessly at her infectious smile. "How stupid of me then." "Very," she agreed with sham indignation. A minute ago, she'd had him in the grip of black despair. 5 minutes ago she had sent him into sexual paradise. Now she made him feel like laughing again. Neil thought as he gazed down at the beautiful woman in his arms who'd been playing with his emotions. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Neil was aware that no woman had ever had this effect on him before, but he didn't want to examine the explanation for it. For now, he was content to bask in the present and ignore what little future he had left. Under the circumstances, he whispered, smiling as he brushed his knuckles over her cheek, "What should I have done and said?" "Well, as you know, I don't have much experience in moments like these." "No experience at all, in fact," he reminded her, suddenly and crazily pleased by that. She glared up at him with a small pout. "But I have read hundreds of scenes like this in novels. This isn't a novel, M.I.A. more." "True, but there are little similarities," she argued. "Then name one similarity," he teased, distracted by the sheer joy of her. To his astonishment, she brightened up, but there was a look of wonder in her eyes as they gazed deeply into his. "One thing I know," she whispered, "the woman often feels the way I felt when you were inside of me." "And how did you feel?" he asked because he couldn't stop himself. "I felt wanted," she said with a tiny break in her voice. "And needed, desperately needed, and very, very special. I felt complete with you inside me." Neil's heart tightened with an emotion so intense that it made him ache. "Then why were you crying?" "Because sometimes beauty and happiness does that to me," she whispered softly. Neil gazed into her glowing brown eyes, and he saw the kind of gentle beauty and unquenchable spirit that could almost make a man feel like crying. "Has anyone ever told you," he whispered huskily, "that you have the smile of an angel?"